Great talk. All right, next up we have the Thomas Reed. I feel like he doesn't need much of an introduction. All of us in the space are well aware of all the great work he's doing. He's going to be giving an interesting talk of kind of Mac malware, adware by the numbers, which is really interesting because working at Malwarebytes, he has great insight into larger trends that some of us as individual security researchers might not see. So really interested in Thomas's talk. We missed him last year. He did speak virtually, so super stoked though here in person. So let's give Thomas a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you. And I was looking at the picture from last year, and I was wearing the same shirt by coincidence. So different hat, but there was a hat. Yeah. So all right. So as Patrick mentioned, today we're going to be talking about Mac detections by the numbers. We're not just going to talk about data. We're going to talk about some threat characteristics and stuff like that as well. So I'll try and mix it up a little bit. A little bit about myself, as said, I do work for Malwarebytes. If you want to talk to me about anything, you can find me on Twitter. There's my email address. All questions, all comments, anything. You're welcome to contact me anytime. So let's just start off with a little bit of info about our overall detection so far this year. And you can see it's been more or less steady, sort of between 7.5 and almost 15 million. There's some dips and rises in there, but nothing like really huge. So if we look a little bit more at like the geographical distribution of everything that we've seen this year, you see it's very strongly weighted towards the US, with the UK and Australia and Canada and whatnot all following up. This is pretty much in line with our customer base. So we have a very strong US customer base, and then we have a lot of folks in Europe. You'll notice there's not a lot. Actually, there are no countries in that top 10 that are in the pie chart in Asia. We don't have a real strong presence in Asia. In particular, China, our software has trouble getting through the Great Firewall, so it's we don't have a strong presence there, so our data there is not as strong. So the top things that we have seen this year, and this changes every year, it's kind of interesting to watch how this changes. I think last year, the very topmost item was PCVARK. They're a potentially unwanted program vendor, also known by some other names like Innovus, ThinkLabs, and Systweak. But this year, the top was JDI, which I believe stands for Just Do It, or Just Develop It, something like that. And they develop, among other things, Total AV and ScanGuard. They also got a little bit more notoriety back 10 years ago or so with things like ZipCloud and JustCloud and all those kinds of things that were in so many bundle installers back in the day. So they seem to mostly have retired those things. You don't see them as much anymore, but now it's ScanGuard and Total AV, which are just clones of each other under different names. And then one little fun fact here about our detections. We had one detection in Antarctica this year. And it was this Search EXT Safari extension. This is a really old Safari extension. That kind of Safari extension doesn't even work anymore. I think this particular adware is something that we called Conduit, which we also don't see a whole lot of anymore. So it's kind of interesting that this turned up in Antarctica, of all places. Was it this guy? I don't know. Probably not, but it's kind of interesting to theorize what might have been going on there. So when it comes to some of the new actual malware, so we're sort of throwing out all the pups and adware for now. When we're looking at what was new this year with just the malware, our top detections were a generic sort of a behavioral detection that we have in our engine, osx.generic.suspicious, which is kind of a generic name on purpose. There are things from many different families of malware and adware and whatnot that fall into this category. And in general, they're all very suspicious behaviors. And so in this case, what was added this year, what we added to it, was there was a new version of vSearch, also known as Purit, or however you say it, in the Windows world. And it added this script called helper update in the user's bin folder, which I don't think I've ever, I don't know if anybody else in here has ever seen a bin folder in the user home folder. I haven't. So we put in a sort of a generic rule for this because it is kind of suspicious, and all it has in there is kill all terminal, which is pretty suspicious. So that's one new thing we saw this year. But in the past with this one, so here are some of the things we've seen. And you'll notice here there's a trend. Most of the things that we are detecting with this are all launch agents and daemons. So we see a whole bunch of these where it's a launch daemon with this weird like com.uuid.plist form. You can scroll through our data and see just like tons and tons and tons of different UUIDs. We see a lot of these. So it's a launch daemon again that's named com. 2 or 3 words that are randomly chosen, I believe, from a dictionary with a P at the end, .plist. So we see tons and tons of these coming through. There's this folder in application support. We see tons of these where it's just a dot with a UUID after it, and there's some pretty suspicious stuff inside that folder. Lots and lots of other UUIDs there. And then here, I'm just scrolling through a list of items in launch agents that are named either com.somerandomword.plist or com.somerandomword. And then two random letters.plist. And you can see in this video, it just keeps going and going and going. And if we keep watching, we won't even get out of the A's. So, this is very, very prolific, lots and lots and lots. And it's really difficult to detect this sort of thing by name. You have to go into the content. And before we talk a little bit about the data, just what exactly is suspicious about these things? In a lot of cases, it's something like piping something from curl into bash, or taking some weird, base64 encoded chunk of text, passing that through base64 and then piping that into Python, or a number of other things like this that really shouldn't be going on inside of a launch agent or daemon plist. And so here on the data, what you'll see is we've actually seen a bit of a decline in this over the course of the year. Now, that decline is kind of relative because we still are seeing a lot of this, but it's definitely not as much recently as we were seeing towards the beginning of the year. And where do we see all this kind of stuff? So most of it, again, is in the United States, which is kind of expected because that's where our customer base mostly is. But in this case, there's a little bit of a difference in that, with our global detections, there was this small little, I think it was like 8% was in the other category, and here 25% is in that other category. So we see a lot more of this in some of those more, less, the countries that we have less representation in. So, for example, Asia. So let's take a look at DubRobber. This is one also known as XCS-SET. This is one that came out this year. It came out in January, I believe. I'm sorry, actually, this one came out last year, but JAMF, and we have some representation in here, discovered a new 0-day in a new variant of this malware. So we had some new samples to play with, and that's why it's in here. It was discovered last year, but there was some new stuff. And this malware uses a lot of run-only Apple scripts, which are pain in the butt to figure out what exactly they're doing. There's no easy way to decompile these things. I know Phil Stokes has some information about it on his blog, but on SentinelOne, but it's still, even with all the tips that he gives, it's really difficult to crack into these run-only Apple scripts. So, I mean, there's a reason the bad guys are using those these days, and this isn't the only malware that does that. So, as you can see here, we saw a pretty high spike in DubRobber right around the time that this new variant was discovered, and then it fell back off again pretty quickly. So, that's usually because that particular variant, there were a lot of machines that were infected by it, and then once they were sort of cleaned up, we were past the point where it was still being distributed. This one, we do not see our normal, this is not our normal customer base that's strongly US. This was 50% Pakistan, then India, and then the United States was only 6%. So this one was more strong in the Middle East. Also, there's some, Japan is on the list, Hong Kong, China. So it's stronger in Asia as well, rather than in the US and Europe. ElectroRat was another one from this year. This one was discovered January 5th, so very early on in the year, and it was a fake cryptocurrency trading app that was really designed to steal your cryptocurrency. And it dropped some files on the system that were designed to look like Spotlight-related files. That's a pretty common thing that we see on Mac OS, as I'm sure most of you guys who deal with malware know. And there were all kinds of other support files that it dropped as well. So ElectroRat, we really haven't seen a whole lot of it. We've seen a total of 4 cases, and all of them were in the United States. So, and as you can see, we haven't seen it since April. So this one, I don't know why it's so small. It's possible that it really was never widely distributed, or it's possible that we just saw the cases that were in the US and we didn't really, maybe it was more strongly distributed somewhere else that we don't have a strong customer base. We just don't know. OSA Miner was one that was found in January 11th, and it also, like DubRobber XCS-SET, it also uses some run-only Apple scripts. And it actually had this trick where it went to this website shown in this screenshot from the SentinelOne website, and it downloaded a miner script that was disguised as a PNG file, but that PNG file was actually a run-only Apple script. And so that was kind of, you don't see that kind of stuff with Mac malware as often. Usually it's very straightforward, so disguising this as a PNG and downloading it was sneakier than we usually see on Mac OS. This one we did see, we've been seeing some fairly constant detections at a fairly low level. They peaked a little higher back around the time that it was new. But as you can see, we're still seeing a few here and there every month, but not huge numbers at all by any means. And this one was very strong in China, but also had representation in the United States fairly strongly. So, but you'll see there are a lot of other, like in addition to China, there's Hong Kong, Taiwan, Thailand. So there were a lot of other Asian countries that were on the list here. So this one was very strong in Asia. Silver Sparrow, Tony talked about this one. I think that was earlier today, right? Yeah. Starting to lose track of which talks were what day, but so this one, as Tony mentioned, it was distributed through a file inside the PKG file, the distribution file, which ran a JavaScript that dropped all the executables. And this one it had the infamous ._INSU file. And this caused a lot of stir because if that file was present, the malware would uninstall itself, but nobody really knew what that file looked like. Nobody knew where it came from. We got some data on detections of the .INSU file and got some hashes of it, all exactly the same hash, and if you hash an empty file, you get the same hash. So it was just a completely empty file. Still have no idea where it was coming from. There are many theories, like maybe the malware had run its course and the operators had decided to self-delete, so they had it deploy this file and self-delete. Could be that it was from something else. We don't know. And there was a lot of controversy about that file. So we were initially detecting that .INSU file because we wanted some intelligence about it. We wanted to know what was in it. And we found out pretty quickly that it was just an empty file. And you can see our numbers there were pretty high. And these included those .INSU files. Now, after a while, we decided, this isn't a malicious file. It's just an empty file. We should probably stop detecting it. Plus, there were some people that were actually using it as a means of preventing the infection. So they would actually put the .INSU file on their hard drive to keep themselves from getting infected. And we were like, well, yeah, we don't want to mess with that. So we stopped detecting, and you can see that it dropped off right away. Now, what you can't see in this data is, what's hidden in that mountain there. How much of that is the .INSU file and how much is everything else? So how much did it actually drop? So I filtered the data. I got up this morning and actually did this. I was inspired after talking to Tony yesterday. This is what it looked like without those INSU file detections. And so you can see there was definitely a spike back in February, but it was not nearly as high without the .INSU files. So that's what the actual data looked like without the empty files. And this one was very predominantly in the United States. This one, you can't memorize all the pie charts, but if you compare this to our global, the pie chart of our global distribution of everything we've detected this year, it's very, very similar to that. So this one was pretty much, distributed within, sort of uniformly within our customer base. Electrum Stealer, this one was one that showed up in February, and it was a fake version of Electrum. Again, this was, designed to steal your cryptocurrency. There were a whole bunch of Reddit threads about this, and they were outing this app as being a fake. And it really wasn't anything fancy. It was just the app. It didn't install any kind of persistence method, didn't install anything else on the hard drive. It was just the app. But I mean, for its goal, stealing your cryptocurrency, that's all it needs, right? This one actually, we have never seen an actual detection in the wild. No idea why. It could be that it's outside of our user base. Maybe it's stronger in China and not that widespread in China, so we haven't seen it. Maybe it's just very, very rare. We just don't know, but we've never seen it before in the wild. Xcode Spy was another really interesting one that came out in March. This one actually was delivered through compromised Xcode projects. And so what the bad guys did here is they added a very obfuscated script to an Xcode project that would run as soon as you built and ran the project. And they were distributing this. So, obviously the intent here is to infect targeted developers who are using Xcode. And what it would do is it would actually install an Eggshell backdoor. Eggshell, if you're not familiar with it, is an open source backdoor. I think it's still up on GitHub. And so, if you're interested in seeing what it does, you can go download it. If it's not on GitHub anymore, I haven't looked in a while. I'm sure you could find it somewhere. So, but obviously the intent here was to infect these developers, get a backdoor in their system, and then who knows what, steal credentials, maybe get a supply chain attack in place, who knows. This one, again, we've not seen any detections of this one ever. Now, part of that might be because it is believed to be North Korean in origin. So that's definitely outside our user base. We have nothing in North Korea. It's also possible, if it's North Korean in origin, that it might be used in very targeted attacks. And those can be very difficult to pick up. If you don't have Malwarebytes installed, we can't pick it up. And, there are plenty of people that could be targeted that wouldn't have it installed. So this is probably mostly outside our user base and maybe only used in a very small number of cases. So Wild Python. Now this is one actually, we call it Wild Python. It was discovered by Kaspersky. They called it Wild Pressure. We didn't choose to call it Wild Pressure because that was the name of the threat group rather than the malware itself. So we wanted to kind of, name it a little bit differently than the threat group. I see Tony back there. So we named it Wild Python just so that if you ever see that in our detections or anything like that. We have no idea what the dropper was, and I actually contacted the guy who did the write-up for Kaspersky, and he hadn't seen it either. There was a guard.py file, a Python file that dropped everything, and it had both Windows and Mac code in it, so it was capable of infecting either a Windows or a Mac machine. There may have been a PyInstaller build that was capable of infecting macOS. We don't really know. By itself, just a Python file isn't really, that's not the transmission vector. That's going to be like a second stage or something like that. We have no idea what the first stage was. And so we kind of wonder, is this actually even in the wild for Mac, or was it that somebody built this script and wrote it for both Mac and Windows in case they wanted that, but they never actually deployed it for Mac? We don't know, but we've seen no detections of this again, ever. Technically, we did see 6 detections, but I was able to determine that those all were coming from someone testing with our app to see if it was detected. And this was like right after the write-up was published, just to see if we were detecting it.
How did you know there were some tests?
There was something in the data that I could see that I could identify, and that was mainly because it's somebody that I was familiar with. So yeah, I wouldn't have been able to tell except for that. So. And this, it was believed that this was kind of, targeting the Middle East and also targeted attacks. So again, this is probably mostly outside of our user base because we don't have a strong user base in the Middle East. But again, we really don't know if this is even in the wild for Mac or just for Windows. Xloader is another recent one. This was in July, and it was built in Java. So let that sink in for just a minute. When's the last time that a Mac had Java installed? It's been a long time. They ripped that out a long time ago. Not only was it Java, but of course it was not signed. So like how do you, how is the average user going to use this to infect themselves? It's really unrealistic. And then, of course, you run it, and it's very common, as I'm sure all of you know, for these apps that act like a document to open some kind of a decoy document while they're doing their bad stuff in the background, right? We see that all the time. So it opened a decoy document, but the decoy document was just a PNG file of the Microsoft Word icon. So not exactly a very convincing decoy document. You kind of wonder where the requirements went wrong on that one. Like, hey, can you open a decoy document? Make it Microsoft Word. Somebody decided to use the icon instead. So, and it was designed to harvest credentials, among other things. There was a lot in there that we still really didn't know everything that it was capable of doing. But this just was not very realistic malware, as a Java file and being unsigned. And as you might expect from that, again, no detections ever, except for 4 false positives. So we don't know if this is actually truly in the wild. Maybe there's incomplete intel, so there's something out there that we're not aware of. And then finally, Zuru, which Patrick did the first write-up for, first write-up within the US. There was a Chinese blog about it as well, but most people didn't see that. And this was not really a supply chain attack. It was Trojanized apps. The one that was first known was iTerm2. And so you run the app, and it drops these 2 files in the temp folder, g.py and something called Google Update. And g.py was very easy to read. You could read through and see everything it was doing, and basically it was harvesting a whole bunch of data related to credentials and other things like that. And then the Google Update was a Mach-O binary, and it was it was basically a backdoor. And so, you get the idea here. This is harvesting credentials and then looking to move laterally. So potentially something very targeted. Now, we have seen a couple detections of this so far since it was discovered. It hasn't been that long since the discovery, so there might be some new data that will come up at some point. But in this case, it was on the same machine. So one detection on September 17th, and then another one of the same file on the 18th. And it was the Navicat Premium app, which had been Trojanized. And this detection was in Thailand. So I'm not sure exactly why it was detected 2 days in a row. It could be that the first day, maybe the user was like, no, I don't, that's legit. I'm not going to quarantine that. That's got to be a false positive. And then the next day they let it be quarantined. Or it's possible that, they skipped quarantining it the first day, and then when it was detected the second day, they went in and added an exclusion for it, so it's still on their system potentially. Don't really know, but it's we may see more out of this one in the future, but it looks like it might be outside of our user base again, because it is. There were a lot of indicators here that it was in China and other Asian countries, which is kind of outside of our area. So I did this after Apple released numbers 11.2 with the support for these radar charts. So of course I had to nerd out and go and add one. So this shows the distributions of Silver Sparrow and Dub Robber, or XCS set. You can see that Dub Robber was mainly Middle East and Asia, as we mentioned, and Silver Sparrow was really mainly North America and Europe. And it's kind of interesting to see how those distributions look on the chart. All the others that we talked about, they'd be like a little fraction of a pixel down there around the 0 axis. So not a lot of detections, and in some cases, in a lot of cases, no detections for a lot of those other things. Any questions? And if you want the slides, you can, I promise I'm not Rick-rolling you or something like that. That really is the right link. Yeah, so, but yeah, any questions? Yeah.
So the distributions are interesting. How would you say they break down in terms of, you see some malware that's written probably for Chinese targets, it's going to be more in China.
Right.
Or is it that it was just written in China and it's distributed there? So it's kind of the authorship versus the targeting. Is it one versus the other?
Yeah, it's hard to tell, especially with the Asian countries because we don't have a lot of representation there. But yeah, generally what we see is, if something is coming from a Chinese or, Asian threat actor, whether it's Ocean Lotus, from Vietnam, or whether it's something from North Korea or whatever, it generally tends to be used in those same regions, maybe not in the same country, but in the same general region. So we often don't see a lot of those things. We don't see much Ocean Lotus. We don't see much of, any of the North Korean stuff. So.
Maybe you have to send that paper. Does that trend hold also in like the Middle East? Targeting versus?
Yeah, it seems to with the Middle East as well. It seems to hold true with the Middle East as well, as far as we can tell. Now, I'm sure there are some, there are going to be some cases where they're targeting maybe some, activist here in the United States that's speaking out against, a country in the Middle East. But yeah, for the most part, it seems to stay within those regions from what we've seen. Now, I don't know what other people have seen, so other people might have different data. Yeah.
What's the breakdown of detections for enterprise users versus home users?
Oh, the question for those at home, what's the breakdown for enterprise versus home users? I didn't crunch a lot of data on that. We will do that at the end of the year when we do our state of malware report. But in general, we tend to see a lot more detections on consumer. We have a lot larger consumer customer base. And last year, there was a difference in what was detected in enterprise versus consumer. And it was not something you would expect. You'd expect some of the more malicious, nasty stuff to be targeting enterprise. And what we saw, if I'm remembering right, was that it was a really high number of pups in enterprise versus more adware in the consumer space. So we'll see. That might hold true again this year. Yeah.
Any predictions for next year?
Predictions for next year. It has been a really quiet year so far this year. Obviously we've seen some things. We talked about all this malware that's dropped this year, but yeah, hopefully I'm not jinxing us. But yeah, it's been quiet this year, but it tends to come in waves. That's what I've learned about over years of watching the Mac threat landscape is it'll be quiet for a while, and then right when you're starting to get comfortable and you're like, oh yeah, things are good, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh my God, I've got to analyze 3 new Mac samples, 3 new Mac pieces of malware this week and write 3 blog posts. And yeah, it's crazy. But I do expect one thing that we see very consistently across years is that on macOS, the level of the truly malicious stuff, all the nation state stuff, all of the the miners and the cryptocurrency stealers and all this malicious stuff, that's a fairly low background level compared to all the pups and the adware. That's really where the main traffic is on macOS. You know, that's what the dangers are to the average Mac user. And you know, I talk about the malware as being really nasty and malicious, but you know, don't mess around with the adware. You know, if we've seen that some of the adware folks are producing things that are far more sophisticated than what we see out of nation-state malware for Mac OS. You know, it's crazy. All about the money. Cool. All right. Thank you.